Yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to the release of the dRep white paper. As mentioned by Natalie, we have been community funded and worked the last few months with a number of people on a white paper, which actually has 4 sections: an introduction, and then 3 pieces of work which introduces different topics from different angles, and we're going to go through this today with you, if that's okay. So without any further ado on that one, we probably kind of should start then with the first one. And I think Kenrick, as Philip is not here, can you take the first?
Yes, and in fact,
I'm taking Philip's section.
You are
Sorry.
okay.
right,
You're
but
taking
I'll
Philip's.
start with the introduction. I'll kind of, which is an overview of the whole paper, and just do we have the link in the chat also so everyone can access it while we're live? Have we done that?
Not
Do you have
yet.
it in front of you? Did we do that? Let's do it again so it's available to people.
Yeah.
I think I need to bring it up in my window.
Stephen just posted that one.
Okay. All right, very good. Yeah, so, okay, so in the introduction, and just to set the context of what we were trying to accomplish, we're moving to dReps, which is delegated representatives. That derives from a process known as liquid democracy, where you have a choice to either delegate or vote yourself. And the scope of our work was to try to do some analysis of what the dynamics of this would be. And it's very limited in comparison to all the different issues that are going to come up, but it's a great first step for the community to be doing its own research on this topic. And with that brief, short introduction to the introduction, I could take 1 or 2 questions about the kind of broad scope of our work on this paper. I'm trying to watch the clock too.
So if you can do it perhaps this way, if you want to raise your hand with the reactions, just raise your hand, and then we're going to take it that way. So if you have a question, please raise your hand, and then we can take your question.
Yeah, and to kick us off, if someone wants to just jump in, that's okay too, since we don't have any hands raised right now.
So everyone's too shy at the moment still.
Well, and maybe we need to go into the content more. So I will shorten my introduction and let Stephen go ahead with the first section. And I'll tell you what, I will share my screen while he starts to talk about it.
Thanks, Kenrick. Yes, I will prefix my comments by saying I'm not Philip Laszlos, so I am the comments I'm making on his section of the paper. Are you screen sharing it now?
I'm not able to.
Okay, let's see if no, I don't think any of us are. So if you're following the paper, look at the section called The Role of Delegated Representation in Blockchain Governance. Now, if you see, Philip introduces the paper by setting a kind of broad context for main concerns that have been concerning Cardano and particularly capitalism, which is mainly about incentivizing voter participation. So that's why he says, you know, these critical, important details. Why are the voters abstaining, for example? Is it random? You ask those kinds of questions. That's kind of like the problem statement, how to encourage voter participation. Then he goes on to consider is there an objective quality of the outcome, or is it a matter of approval? And if you look at the way we vote on different things, and certainly on blockchain, sometimes it's like very scientific. It's almost like a code release, you know, so that's very objective. But oftentimes it's a matter of approval. So it's very political. It's about differences of opinion, and that is, you know, he just wanted to put that out there. That's a different kind of consideration. Finally, how are delegates selected? It's a very important point because this is about who can access the franchise. You know, is it based on their social network? You know, the amount of money they have, and is it easy to determine what they're standing for? I'm sorry to go on so quickly. He then goes on to look at the background literature on liquid democracy. And he identifies two main papers. The first one is called Liquid Democracy, a Logarithmic Perspective, which looks at what I was mentioning before, which is mainly the scientific objective type of liquid democracy, which he calls the epistemic settings, which epistemic means knowledge. It means, you know, so just logic. And he looks at that in terms of what objectively can you get out of that, and it's like positive gain or do no harm. One criticism of that approach is that it easily can concentrate power in formal mechanisms. Formal mechanisms are often prone to wild spans of concentration of power. Then he goes on to a different kind. He focuses more on the positive effects of delegation, and he focuses on another paper called In Defense on Fluid Democracy. And they identify, as he says, more realistic assumptions. So this is more about people's preferences. And in this model, in that model, it's about how do you bundle different voters together in order to represent different preferences. So not to try and objectively slice them up, but to try and represent a range of views. So that's the considerations that may be, you know, very, very topical at the moment in that sense is at a high level, what are the different weights, as he puts it, between different voters? Now, you know, some may disproportionately favor, as he puts it, wilds. You know, some voters are more equal than others, depending on the amount of aid they hold. And how much is the influence based on that, and how much of it is based on ideological preferences, which is the correct way, the correct, in inverted commas, way to vote. So you know, he just concludes by referring to Catalyst's approach, which is kind of a hybrid approach, which is taking like elements of those two papers, but then trying to see what checks and balances can be applied. And this is what the work that, like, you know, Jack Riggs and the others have been doing, to try and introduce checks and balances to the introduction of dReps. Obviously, it's not going to be perfect. So yeah. I'm trying to keep it short, Kenrick, sorry. But that's no way does justice to Philip's section, but that was my best shot. Any questions?
Stephen, can you talk about the probabilities that they talk about in there about making it pi? For good?
Maybe a mathematician here can talk to that, because I'm not a mathematician. Kenrick or Steph, can you speak to how Philip Laszlos is using pi at what set? Yeah, go on.
The symbol pi is often used for a probability. That's how he's using it here. And then I'm just quickly, and actually Steph is going to talk about this more.
But saying the fourth voter would make it right. Like if there's only 3, so how do you do the checks and balances so that the vote is true?
So let me read his section here where he discusses this, and then I'll try to answer it. So it says, given a delegation mechanism, the objective here is to maximize the probability that a good outcome is actually selected. Okay, so here, this is a challenging problem where you have to kind of have a way of defining good. Now, in his introduction here and in these papers, they just kind of label that abstractly, where you kind of artificially define a good outcome and a bad outcome. And then you look at the voting dynamics and how often you end up with a result that's considered to be a good outcome versus some sort of malicious outcome. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I kind of get it. And we could use that in the catalyst process a bunch of ways. Maybe why like proposals get a 5-star review, right? What are the checks and balances throughout the system so that we know it's proper in the end? But even with dReps, how do you know everybody's acting proper, right?
Exactly, right. And the, in terms of measuring good outcomes, that would come from a good auditing process where maybe over time you would track how many projects succeed in completing the milestones that they promised in their proposal.
Just to elaborate a little bit, you guys continue. I just I didn't want to leave you with no questions. Obviously, there's a reason you put it in here. You know what I mean? There's a reason why we're trying to figure this part out.
Yeah, exactly. It's an important issue. That's correct. Yep. Thanks for asking the question. And in the interest of just keeping us going, getting through the whole content of the paper first, and then we'll open the discussion more broadly. Maybe Steph can introduce his section.
Sure. This was written in combination with some colleagues of mine, Jesus Hernandez, Seth Chandler, and Ken Rick here. So the bands-off index is a way to measure voting power. And it kind of matters how you define those things. And kind of we have a problem in front of us, which is we have a weighted voting system, which is Project Catalyst. And you have the idea of coalition formation, which means, you know, let's just say that the 10 biggest whale wallets are in a secret room colluding. But you also have a formal introduction coming with dReps, which is coalition formation. And that potentially creates concentrated pools of voting power. And that has a variety of consequences on actually whose vote matters and when. And so to measure that actual distribution of voting power, we are using something called the bands-off power index. This index was created by a lawyer in the 1960s. It was used to look at like the Electoral College in the United States and different things. But essentially, it's an index that measures the ability of each voter to change the outcome of the vote. So the power of a voter actually resides in their ability to change the outcome of the vote from a failing coalition to a winning coalition. And if their vote is kind of that edge case that flips from one side to the other, then they're deemed to have a voting power. And then you collect every time that happens in every possible coalition within a particular vote, and then add that up and divide it by the total number of times that that occurs, and you get a percentage of what their power is. And that percentage of power is not what their actual weight of ADA tokens are, or the weight of from which they entered the vote. So it's different. And there can be dictatorship outcomes where one entity can dictate the entire outcome of the vote. And there can be a lot of dummy votes, meaning these are votes that basically have no impact. And so those are important to know for people. And I think the leading question it came from Kenrick to me, which was, you know, what if the top 10% of wallets in Project Catalyst decided to vote the same way? How much could they affect? And so the results to that, which is a very simplified approach, kind of showed us that if the top 10% of wallets came together, that they could form a dictatorship. And so that was like, let's dig in. Why could that be the case? Well, and what is the actual distribution of wallets in the data that we have? And the data that we did have was from Fund 5. And that was 32,000 wallets. And
Steph,
that,
just take another 30 seconds or so to kind of,
Okay.
conclude your section, and then we'll open up for a question or two, and we'll come
Okay.
back and discuss it more.
okay. So that was, I think the leading question was, how does a coalition impact the outcome of a voting process? And we dove into the numbers for Fund 5 because that's where we had data. And I think we found some interesting results, and we found definitely some ways where we could make the process better. Our process and potentially the Catalyst process. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. So it sounds like you're talking. So first, by the top 10% of wallets, by that you mean the largest wallets.
Yeah.
So whales, effectively tracking their behavior. But then you were talking about,
if you say the top 10%, it's if there's 32,000 wallets, then what are the top 3,200 wallets?
In terms of size, in terms of
Right.
plutocratic voting power. But then you were talking earlier about what sounded like swing states almost. So those who are on the fringe, in the border between two coalitions, actually have a disproportionate amount of voting power just by which way they go actually determines the whole outcome. So that's not necessarily about massive voting power because it's elevated by the where they sit. Is that
it's yes, it's that, but it's how many times does one particular wallet impact the whole distribution of coalitions? So like if there are only 3 entities, there can be a total, like there can be entity. So let's use a familiar example. We have IOG, Cardano Foundation, and Emergo. If you have 3 entities, you can have a total of 7 subsets. So 7 ways to arrange those. You can have IOG by itself, you can have Cardano Foundation by itself, you can have Emergo by itself, then you can have 2 of them together and 1 by itself, and then you can have all 3. In those 7 different subsets, which entity can actually dictate the outcome? And so if it matters what the threshold is, if you have a total of 7 votes and they need to reach 5, and one has 3 votes and one has 2 votes and the other has 2 votes, then you only need 2 of them to really reach that winning threshold. And so one can be considered not powerful. If one of those 2 drops out, then the coalition switches from winning to losing. And then you can consider that one that drops out powerful. And then we add up all of those moments and divide by the total powerful moments, and you get kind of that bands off power index.
Thanks, John and Steph. That's great. So this really starts to get us into the conversation. Let's give Aaron a chance to introduce his section, and then we'll open up the conversation.
Thank you, Kenrick. So our section is, you can say that it is composed of 2 parts. Here we try to propose some very, let's say, very way for using a consensus platform for creating and forming consensus around governance documentation. Well, the consensus platform is another funded project by the Catalyst community. It is still in development. We hope that it will be ready for Fund 10 for the first use of the dRep. If not, it will be for sure ready for Fund 11. And the idea here is that the dRep system will require for sure some documentation for its governance, as code of conduct, as guidelines, as we are working today in other aspects of the Project Catalyst and the whole Cardano governance. And forming consensus is a great challenge around the documentation. So in this section, we propose a way to do this by using the consensus platform, how we can create together those documentation in a community-driven fashion, in a decentralized manner. And by that to create the framework and the baseline for the work of the dRep. So we can prevent from advanced misuse of this system, and we can achieve together the goals of the representation of the Catalyst community by this system. The other part of this section is some kind of a suggestion of how we can use versatile democratic and voting system in our governance processes. So the dRep system will add to the governance of Cardano and Catalyst the liquid democracy. But liquid democracy is not the only system. We know representative system from nation state, from democratic nation state. We are using the plutocratic of one coin, one vote system right now in DAOs, in Cardano, and other blockchains. And by combining other voting system and decision-making methods, we can create a very diverse system that we can use in different voting system and use different decision-making methods for different needs of the community. So, Kenrick, if you can scroll down a little bit more, we created this figure to show this is a framework, a proposal, how can we use different voting system for different needs of the community. So we divided this documentation governance to 3 levels: high level, mid level, and low level. As the highest level are the most abstract, as a vision or constitution, and the low levels are the most practical. So it goes to for parameter changes in the protocol and using treasuries and other aspects of the operation. And by implementing different voting system and different decision-making method for different needs of the community, we can bring the benefit of each one of the system for the needs of the community. So we don't need to use only one system as plutocratic of one coin, one vote, or just the liquid democracy. That each of these systems has its pros and its cons. And by building and by looking at this as different building blocks that we can use in a different context, we can use the advantage of each system in the right way, and by that create a diverse governance system to the Catalyst Cardano governance.
Thanks, Aaron. That's terrific. Are there questions on the work that Aaron is doing on providing community documentation writing? Someone offer a good question.
If no one has a question, I'll step in.
Go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah. Hi, Aaron. When you say there's different types of documentation appropriate for different types of decision making, do you have that documentation in development, or is it just are you just scoping it for the present?
For now, it is just a proposal. Of course, it's open for discussion and for changes. On the consensus platform, we have some design plans of how we can create different templates for different documents. but it will be only in the future. For now, it will be one template for all the documentation. So it will be according to the use of the community, how these different levels of documentation will be implemented.
So it'll be a combination of referencing the decision-making method, like plutocratic, meritocratic, with consultation with the community.
Of course. Everything here is just a suggestion. It's just a framework for further discussion.
Great, thanks very much.
Dan,
Yeah, great.
Yeah, Aaron, I appreciate your presentation, and it seems to me that there should be a way to simplify this whole process. I agree that there's really this coin-weighted voting or plutocracy and knowledge-weighted voting, which is really the democracy. There's, all humans, I think we really have two different steps in, and those steps are first deciding what we do, and that's where we need knowledge. And that's where we need democracy. And then there's doing what we decide. And that's where the money comes in. How do you take action? How do you act on that? So it seems to me that the meritocracy part of this can be in both of those areas. Those people have more knowledge, have greater merit, and should have greater expertise power in their democratic vote. And those people who spend their money well and are good at allocating and providing for those things should have a merit measure of their plutocratic vote. But if we just split the whole voting system into this notion of money equals power in case of plutocracy, or knowledge is power, and so it's deciding what we do first, and that's where democracy comes in. And doing what we decide is the so this is kind of the way I think of it, as simplifying how we think about this and how we can make it better understood. Just appreciate your comments on that.
Okay.
Yes,
sorry, no,
Go ahead, Aaron, if you can.
Yeah, so yes, we do address what you are talking about, Dan, in the section. You're most welcome to read it. And I tend to agree with you, but not completely. I do believe that first of all, the base value maybe we should agree upon is every human are equal. So first of all, if we wish to create this kind of groups, this group that need to decide who are we, what is our vision, and what our goals, I think this question and question like this in the high level should be determined in a way that every person has the same influence on answering this question. And this should be a democracy, and maybe even a direct democracy system to answer this question. But then we need to ask, how should we, how could we achieve these goals? How should we work? And then different people with different background and different experience maybe have better understanding of answering how should we achieve those goals, and then meritocratic system can be applied. And when we are talking about how should we use the money, then people with bigger stake in the system, this is my belief, should have more influence than people with lesser stake in the system. So in this case, one coin, one vote can be relevant. And as you see, it's very general proposal. It needed to go to be more detailed as you start doing actually, but the reason behind this division is detailed in the white papers. So I hope by reading that you will get also another way to address this.
Great, thanks very much, Aaron. And thanks everyone for joining us. Why don't we open the discussion and let's dig into either content to this paper, but also recognizing that not everyone has had a chance to read it yet. We can also have an open discussion about the dRep process and what questions about that process are on people's minds.
Yeah, bear in mind, people, that there is going to be, I think, a Saturday swarm session, isn't there, Torsten? So there's if you want some more time to digest what's been, obviously, you know, we've just released it yesterday. We will return to this as much as possible to give people an opportunity to comment and to discuss.
Hello, everyone. If somebody knows, I think it might be interesting for everyone who is willing to become dRep. Interesting to say that the form is still working for application, because yesterday I was checking dRep successful proposals from Fund 9, and I was surprised the number 10 proposal, number 8 proposal, which won funding. It was kind of empty proposal, which had only a link to the application form. The budget was $100, and by the way, maybe somebody knows, was it a joke, or the name of it that something like everyone can be dRep? Yeah, so the question is, it's still possible to apply, and when approximately would be the registration on the voting portal? I think somewhere in November. So we'll be informed, but maybe somebody knows more information.
I think that was a marketing ruse by Danny, and wasn't it? But so it was meant to kind of just draw attention to registration. I think registration is still open. But Scott, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I haven't had the opportunity to read the paper yet. Apologies for that. I guess with dRep, I mean, my main concern, and I don't know if it's touched on, I know we kind of skimmed through the paper, but is the honesty of the dReps to declare that they are going to vote on their own proposals, or vote on a buddy's proposal. You know, it's like that, the bad acting that's kind of like almost built into anything in blockchain that's available. And I know there's been some discussion about conflicts of interest and stuff of that nature, but again, how do you monitor that? So I don't know, I think the honesty of the dReps, because there is a lot of grifting going on in Catalyst, whether or not people want to acknowledge it or not.
As an intellectual point, do you think that matters, Scott? Like, do you think people should be? I think Jack referred to it in one of the workshops. Like if you're a dRep and you want to vote on your own proposals, yeah, and you just are upfront about it and you're honest about it, would you say that's okay?
I mean, yeah, I think so. As long as your delegates know that your intentions to vote, and you're not changing that intention. You know, if you're not declaring that, and then all of a sudden you declare like 12 hours before dRep voting.
So it's about good faith, isn't it? Yeah.
And the reason I bring this up, and I've made reference to this numerous times throughout discussions, is I was watching Maker. Maker has reps also for their voting. I'm assuming it's for their protocol and for some of the other activities that are going on. But it was meet your dRep, or it's meet your rep. And the host asked the rep a very important question. Will you vote the way your delegates want you to vote? And that rep straight up said, probably not. And so that's the issue. That's the issue I see going forward, honestly. And then maybe coercion or collusion between dReps to pass a particular proposal, maybe that they're interested in, but have to declare it. So,
I think
we have
an opportunity in Fund 11 to test that, Scott, to see, because we'll be, you know, so, but if I pass, because Steph, you've had your hand up for a while, so.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question to the group here about if my thinking about dReps is kind of accurate and where it's not. So 100 to 150 dReps are possible. I think that's the range, right? And if let's say all of the voting power is delegated, then we would have about 100 to 150 dReps. And then let's say 10, you know, each one can only have 1% of the voting power. So how would it, I think it would be useful to know at what point do you need of those 100 dReps to get in a room together and collude to be able to completely dictate a whole outcome of Catalyst. And I don't know why, but I find that kind of thought process interesting. I was just curious if we think that that's kind of what, like, that's a potential of what could happen. I don't think that's going to happen, but is that how people think about this as well?
Go ahead, Andre.
Yeah, I think there will be more like invisible cooperation. So firstly, people will speak those whom can they trust, whom they know, and maybe will judge depending from the size of the delegation. Because if the dRep will have a very small size, well, not so many others would be interested to cooperate with him. And that's a really interesting question, and I have no answer to it because we don't know who will be dReps. Well, we can see some of the candidates. Some people said that they will be. And we don't know if the people will delegate and how much they will delegate. For me, also interesting point is that would there be a minimum level of delegation, because maximum is 1%, but the minimum, because we might have more candidates than 100. Well, maybe not for this fund, but for future funds, there might be several hundreds candidates who will be. So how some people would be allowed to be a dRep is that those who registered earlier and others would not be accepted. Probably this feature would also be implemented at some point.
Can I just say that if anyone here's got a question that's likely Andre, that question was quite relevant to Catalyst's implementation of dRep. And there is a channel on the Project Catalyst server called dRep that you can post questions that Jack O'Brien will respond to. So what you just raised there, I don't know the answer to, but Jack might be able to respond to that. So I would encourage you to post it. Sorry, Cameron. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were finished. I didn't mean to interrupt. But I can respond also to Steph's question, because in one sense, the dRep process might, if you took Steph's kind of preface that everyone was delegating to a dRep, then I think those dReps would actually be a more equal setting than the current situation, because they have saturated the amount of voting power that each dRep has. So that puts a limit on the tail. So there is no tail. And the tail is where you get these skews in power. So that part of it maybe is a positive outcome of the dRep process. I think that other questions with regard to, if you only have a small ADA, do you exercise more power by delegating to a dRep or by voting yourself? And we aren't far enough along in the analysis to answer that question. Some of the papers that Philip references tried to work on that, but that's the analysis for that is actually pretty hard. Now, there's been claims made that this will empower lower ADA holding individuals. I'm not convinced of that, but I haven't, only because I haven't seen any analysis yet. But that's part of what, a good second, another good proposal would be, is to look at that more carefully.
Yeah, my intuition is that it will just reproduce the current situation. but because of the plutocratic nature of voting, so the only thing that's changing is that you're segmenting the representation. So you're just saying, okay, so if a lot of people are, if a lot of big wallets, for example, are voting for development proposals, that's not going to change under dReps. You're just going to have dReps who say, I represent development proposals. And then you can have a lot of big wallets coming along and voting for them. You know, that's why I think. Maybe I'll be wrong.
If we continue the comparison between the current system and the dRep system, well, there is a major difference that the dRep are not anonymous, as right now the other holders are, which make it much easier to collide if they will try. Right now, to reach out to some whale, for some whale to reach out for some other whale that possess some millions of ADA and to collide together to vote for some proposal, it's not, I guess, it's not so easy as you just know the ADA, the wallet address. You don't know the person, the way to connect with this person. In the dRep system, the names are out there. The communication is much easier, and so colliding can be much easier. I don't know if it's an advantage or disadvantage, but it's a major difference.
Yeah, go ahead, Thurston.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a risk which is, I mean, collision is easier, but also kind of like negative impacts of the influence of votes through mechanisms which are outside of the voting system in itself, kind of like in different ways and means. So kind of like you can influence votes probably due to the fact that you know effectively the voting power which is related to that one person in different forms, yeah, which also happened in other scenarios in a political environment. So and I think that will, due to the fact that we have a nominated number potentially of people who have a higher voting power than a lot of the mean average, it probably kind of takes then the ability away of the individual to really have a casting vote at the end of the day. So I think what will happen, and that's my prediction, is people might not jump onto it, but what I can see is people will recognize which dReps kind of like bring proposals home with their votes and which ones are not, and that might even kind of lead to concentration up to the 1% for a number of dReps, and then in the next layer, the building of coalitions, which kind of like is building effectively a system of parties where effectively votes are kind of like depending on a number of coalitions.
Yeah, this is these are good points, Thurston, and I'll make two comments. I think in addition to kind of a code of conduct within the dReps, there almost needs to be a code of conduct within the community too, because people who are proposing are going to be under enormous pressure to influence these dReps. And as others pointed out, because they're now public figures and their votes are public, I'm concerned about the pressures that dReps are going to be under and whether those pressures are going to be ethical. And then on the flip side of it, as you know, Steph said in his introduction to his section, the key thing that this bands-off index shows is that your power grows non-linearly as you're able to correlate votes. And so this goes to the heart of why political power parties are so powerful and why once they form, they're so hard to oppose. And so I do think that the formation of coalitions within the dReps is not necessarily going to be a positive influence. You know, part of some of the presentations that have been given about dReps is this idea that the dReps are going to be a board of experts that are going to collaborate together. But that collaboration could quickly turn into factions that are, kind of committed to each other. And then with that sort of potentially controlling power, then they also set the terms for the community as to what they expect from the community in order to give their votes to particular projects.
I mean, there was a statement which is you have to delegate to a dRep for every single funding round. But on the other side, the normal expectation, which I would see, is you would try to figure out who is effectively the winning team and support that one. So no one is deliberately giving his vote to a representation where you can already foresee that your vote in itself is wasted. That makes sense. So kind of like everyone, and because there has to be a certain level of transparency, that is almost like deciding where you want to vote by knowing the outcome of the voting, at least to a quite large percentage, which will drive potentially voters in the direction of, okay, so it will polarize that voting mechanism in itself very clearly. And I think from my point of view, it depends really on the transparency of dReps and how much transparency has to be to effectively attract voters versus how much does it give the outcome away and gives then abilities kind of to start to interact effectively with the voting outcome based on the knowledge of some votes which will be casted.
Right.
And what you said, Kenrick, about that debate about, and I suppose it's optimism as well, like where IOG is suggesting that, well, whatever community governance stuff comes forward, whether it's Circle, whether it's PAs, whether it's dReps, is that they can take on some responsibility for things, and arguably you could say that's running ahead of itself until that's been tested, so the dReps, I mean, the first thing we need to observe with the dReps, I think as Scott been pointing out, is how they're going to act in the first round, because, we need to find out, the degree of collusion, whether the natural syndicates are going to be formed, or whether they're actually going to, the degree of deception that might be going on, that kind of thing, and that will give us some idea about whether they are suitable for governance, for broader governance, I mean, outside of just voting.
Well, and I wonder too, there's something similar that goes on right now within the stake pools, right? So we all delegate to stake pools. And we've seen that there are organizations that are running multiple stake pools. And we have clear mechanisms to saturate the power of an individual stake pool, but we don't have mechanisms right now to saturate the power of an organization running multiple stake pools. And I foresee something similar in the dReps. They've put a saturation limit on one dRep, but there's not an easy way to saturate the power of a group of dReps working together. Now, there are proposals on that. If you read the literature on the quadratic voting, it includes measurements of correlation between votes and using, it's sort of, if all your votes are correlated with another individual, then your votes get saturated because of that correlation. So something like that could be possible.
I mean, in terms of, if people want to read maybe some clue about where Philip Laszlos refers to, wanting to represent preferences, voter preferences. So if you read that part of the sentence where he says, so he refers to that white paper that considers voters' preferences where they lie on a metric space. So what capitalists might be trying to do is represent a range of views in the community. And the challenge is if you like, almost like the objective challenge is it just going to follow the old pattern, the old plutocratic pattern, or can you resist that and then make it more representative in terms of voter preferences?
Right. Right. Well, let's hear some more questions from the community. What's on people's minds about these issues?
So one thing that I keep thinking about with dReps going in, certainly in the last fund, the sort of rise of strategic voting with the up and down votes. You're not so much making decisions based on the merit of a proposal, but rather on, well, this is the one I want to win, so I'm going to downvote everything else. And if we see that propagated throughout dReps as well, then that's an awful lot of strategic voting that can go on. And then you start talking about collusion and groupings of dReps. That's an awful lot of negative power. So I've often thought about, well, I mean, I'm not an advocate of negative voting in any way, downvoting anyway, but I think removing it from dReps might be they only have a positive vote, might be a way to.
That's an interesting point in term, because the other thing I've thought about if you're acting as a dRep and you decide to vote against a proposal, that's one of the areas where you're going to get a lot of negative energy from those proposers, right? And how do you, the challenges of handling that in a public role aren't easy. And so that's an interesting point where if the dReps could only vote for a positive, but you continue to allow individuals to vote positive or negative. I haven't looked at this, so I think more analysis would be needed. But you raise a really interesting point, Jonathan, that the fact that the dRep is public makes the consequences of a negative vote much more significant and potentially not something that can be handled easily by those dReps.
I don't know, sorry if I may say whether that's actually a good idea, because it would take it would actually accelerate the impact of Wales in that context due to the voting system in itself, which means you have to have a 15% gap to be considered in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which accelerates the negative vote over the positive vote anyhow already.
Yeah.
Which gives then it becomes more predictable, and the negative vote is accelerated. So actually kind of like you can very easily then determine the voting power you have to totally offset any dRep vote, which you're not to conclude with. And I mean, this is not for someone who has 500 ADA. I think what becomes more and more clear is that the 500 ADA votes in itself it has to kind of come together significantly to make an impact. I mean, that's kind of clear. We see that in some votes which have been heavily negatively voted downwards, and the vast majority of people upvoting kind of outweigh that. But the number of cases I have seen, at least in the last funding round, were very limited. But what you can see is actually that you don't need an equivalent voting power to eliminate effectively someone getting the proposal approved. So,
other questions? Anyone? Well, maybe we should wrap up. This has been a terrific conversation. I'm happy to go a little bit longer if there's other questions, but we could also wrap up. Any other questions from the community? Chris, go ahead.
You're on mute. You're on mute, Chris. There you go.
Yes. I do have a question. So the stake pools and using smart contracts in this, obviously what people need to stay still accountable, right? So what schema can you set up so that you can use like a time frame in a, okay, so if we cut this time frame down to like a 4.5 day cycle, let's just say, and all these 100 dReps need to vote on a proposal, which one do you guys agree on the most should be funded this week? And if 100, if give Stephen a number, like, is it 65%? Would you be good with 71% of people all said, yeah, that's a good idea, go. And then whoever's left that didn't vote stays anonymous. So like, there could still be some like layers there that you didn't get to vote that time, but it still got funded. And there's no yeses and downs, and you got another chance in 5 days. Just like another option to kind of maybe change things up and keep permissions and accountability with maybe a technical council, maybe another team on the other side that reviews some stuff, and just cut the time frame down so it's more of a race to see which one can get funded. Not like how much can we try to fund at once, but whoever everybody agrees on the fastest. That's all I was. I would like to put some notes, but other than that, that's my question. Like, how does the Treasury still get funded? And like delegating to a dRep, how do they get delegation? And why wouldn't you put it into something that pays rewards, then goes into a contract that then they can say, yeah, I'll fund that with this block reward from this week. And here's the money, go build it. Or here for this effort.
Yeah, there's a whole variety of different mechanisms for voting and funding on projects. And as you described, there's the whole different model. What's the famous open source one? Kick bucket or something like that. You know, and so there are alternative models. I don't foresee Catalyst trying to implement those right away. However, people have been proposing those. So for instance, SnapRilla has used Catalyst funding to build its own structure for voting and funding on projects. And you might want to take a look at what SnapRilla has built and prototyped. And they actually got more funding in Fund 9 to develop that further. So they're expecting sometime next year to have it implemented. And that could end up being an alternative funding vehicle for Cardano projects. Thanks for your question, Chris.
Scott.
Yeah, I just got a quick question. Do we actually know the motivation behind IOG's decision to implement dReps? And yeah, anyway, that's pretty much it.
Yeah,
The main,
sorry, Scott, the main reason is to increase voter participation. That was the initial reason. Yeah.
So it's to increase a metric, an advertisable metric within the blockchain community, not Cardano specifically, but with bragging rights, basically within the blockchain community.
Well, I would say it does potentially increase the security though, too. And again, I'd love to see more analysis on this, but if you have larger participation, then there's also the potential that the security of the decisions is strengthened as well. So, but that's the kind of thing that we were trying to kind of do some preliminary research on. We don't have conclusions about that, but Steph has kind of defined very clearly the kinds of analytical processes that you have to complete in order to do that kind of analysis.
Ubio.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So on my part here, my question, I don't know if this question is a contribution, I don't know, but I'm more concerned about the dReps transparency. If there is a way whereby the decisions on their votes can be a lot more transparent, then I think the dRep would be a very important part of the process. So this is what I mean. So let's say as a dRep, there is a process on how decisions are being made on which project to vote and which not to vote, which one you're going to upvote and downvote. So that takes away the problem of collision and the problem of creating another factions and all those other political powers that actually comes with that power that the dRep actually does have, because even his choice is not dependent on him, but there is a transparent process that actually that is used to come to that decision. I don't know how a hell about that, but I'm just talking about how we can put a process that makes decision for even the dRep such that even that decision is also transparent and can actually be traced as well. So people don't just take that part that they're taking from the community and use it to create factions or utilize it negatively. So that's just what I want to add. I don't know if it's a question or it's a contribution.
Thank you.
Does someone want to try an answer to Ubio's question? Do we have any responses to his question?
Okay, if there is no further question, then I will stop the recording.